Last time we spoke about the battle for the Great Wall of China. In 1933, the Kwantung Army faced logistical struggles and sought political deals with Chinese warlords to seize North China. Despite capturing key areas, chaos reigned as their unauthorized operations defied Tokyo's orders. When Emperor Hirohito demanded a withdrawal, the army reluctantly complied, derailing a coup attempt. Though peace talks followed, distrust persisted, and rogue Japanese commanders plotted fresh offensives. Amidst international tensions and the League of Nations in action, chaos loomed over China's battle-scarred plains. As tensions rose in North China, General Muto hesitated to advance without further orders from Tokyo. With imperial approval, he launched a renewed offensive on May the 3rd, leading the Japanese 6th and 8th Divisions to sweep through Chinese defenses. Despite Chinese concessions led by pro-Japanese official Huang Fu, the Japanese pushed towards Beiping. Failed coups and desperate peace talks ensued. By May the 25th, ceasefire talks began, but Japan's strengthened position left China scrambling to secure stability. This episode is the Tanggu Truce. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, a newly titled podcast on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a very long format documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War, titled The Battle for Asia. As for Echoes of War, we are now releasing a 5-part series covering the Malaysian campaign of World War II. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast is actually an alternate history episode. It's going to be a multi-part series covering an alternate history of the Pacific War. This one is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. And I assure you, it's very interesting. Go check it out. Now, as we left off, the IJ 6th and 8th Divisions had just taken up new positions threatening the Beiping-Tianjin area. Meanwhile, the Tianjin Special Service Agency had tried every scheme they could think of to establish a coup against Beiping. All of these actions were done to increase Japan's poker hand at the negotiating table. On May the 17th, Huang Fu arrived at a very panicked Beiping. 2 days prior, the Japanese had taken an even harsher stance, demanding the Chinese forces withdraw to a line running between Shenyu, Baoti, and Lutai. This demand would send the Chinese further west than the line agreed upon for the ceasefire. So the Chinese ignored the demand, and this in turn brought the negotiations to a standstill. On the 18th, the Army General Staff in Tokyo drew up a new draft titled Essentials for the Guidance of North China. Having been chasing around the Kwantung Army like a dog chasing a car, Tokyo HQ wanted to finally draft some real legislation to rein in their unruly pet. On the 19th, the General Staff submitted an ultimatum instructing the Kwantung Army to withdraw to Manchukuo after it had reached the agreement with the Chinese, specifically an agreement to obtain the right to garrison in specific locations within the Great Wall. On the 21st, the Kwantung Army drew up its version of the ceasefire proposal, submitted it to the General Staff, who would approve it, and here is a complete breakdown of it. Number 1. The ceasefire agreement is of a purely military nature and excludes political factors. For by returning to Manchukuo in general as quickly as possible, the Imperial Japanese Army will demonstrate that it acts in the case of justice and fairness, and will manifest the essence of the Japanese spirit. Number 2. The withdrawal line of the Chinese army and the secession line of the Japanese army should conform generally to that referred to in the basic outline of the General Staff. That is, it should conform to the policy of the Kwantung Army and the Nagatsu proposal. However, the return of the Japanese army to Manchukuo will be voluntary, after observance of the ceasefire terms by the Chinese Army have been confirmed, and will not be specifically prescribed in the text of the agreement. Number 3. In order to prevent any delay in the establishment of a ceasefire, the designs of the Tientsin Special Service Agency will also be terminated. Number 4. The site of the ceasefire agreement must be selected with consideration for the issuing of commands to military units in accord with the plans of the Japanese Army. Command with respect to any situation which may necessitate military action at any time during the course of negotiations for a ceasefire. Furthermore, a location convenient to the gatherings of foreign diplomatic officials and press correspondents, and to the meddling intervention by third powers must be carefully avoided. On the 22nd, the Kwantung Army ordered the Tientsin Agency to discontinue their activities, as the Japanese were now willing to accept the ceasefire. The Japanese and Chinese then agreed on a date and a place, that being located along the Beiping-Shanhaiguan Railway, to sign a ceasefire agreement. For the talks, the Japanese naval attaché at Beiping, Lieutenant Commander Fujiwara Kiyoma, was chosen, and he would visit Huang Fu's residence on the 22nd. Talks began at 2 a.m. the next day. Hu Yingqin received a letter officially instructing him to abide by the ceasefire terms. Thus, the first step had been taken. On the 25th, Chinese officials Li Suyi and Xu Yunmu rode with Fujiwara to Miyun, then a temporary HQ for the IG-8th Division. There they passed mounds of dead Chinese placed specifically along the roadside, obviously to intimidate them. They arrived to Miyun at 4 a.m. to officially show the ceasefire proposal letter to General Nishi of the 8th Division. Then they got a real slap in the face. A new demand was tossed right at them. As the first step, in order to verify the compliance of the Chinese Army, the Japanese Army may at any time use airplanes or other means to inspect the withdrawal of the Chinese Army. The Chinese authorities shall afford them the necessary protection and facilities. This last-minute new demand was imposed because Tokyo HQ believed it was necessary to have aerial observation to make sure both parties did not breach the agreement. The two Chinese officials did not want to devolve the talks, so they signed it and they returned to Beiping. The official negotiations began on May the 30th at Tangu. The Kwantung delegation was led by Major General Okimura Yasuji, their Vice Chief of Staff. He was assisted by Colonel Kita Seiichi, Lieutenant Colonel Nagatsu Sahashige, Majors Kono Etsujiro, Endo Saburo, and Fujimoto Tetsukuma. Captain Okubeichi and the Secretary Hayashide Kenjiro of the Japanese Embassy in Manchukuo were also present. The Chinese delegation was led by Lieutenant General Xing Pin and assisted by Chen Zongzi, Xu Yunmu, Chang Shuquang, Li Zuyu, and Li Shuzhang. At the very offset, the Chinese Army declared Tangu under martial law as the Japanese Navy dispatched the battleship Kamoi with the 14th Destroyer Squadron to cruise offshore. The first session of talks began at 4 p.m. It only lasted some 30 minutes as both sides exchanged formal credentials and such. Nagatsu decided to show some of the Chinese delegates a document titled Annex Document Concerning the Organization of Police. This had been drafted by the Kwantung Army to try and establish a demilitarized zone in northeastern Hubei, whose security would be maintained by Chinese police units. The specifics of the document said that such a feat would require a force no larger than 20,000 men, with no single unit exceeding 200, and that they should be armed with nothing stronger than a rifle, pistol, or bayonet. Nagatsu personally believed this was way too much to ask of the Chinese, and he advised changing the wording to what the Chinese police would wield as, quote, shall not be constituted of armed units hostile to Japanese feelings. After seeing the faces of the Chinese upon reading the document, Nagatsu would remark, this evening, the Chinese appear to have gained the impression that our proposal will be excessively harsh. The second session of talks began at 9 a.m. the next day, whereupon General Okimura presented their draft accord. Number 1. The Chinese Army shall immediately withdraw to the regions west and south of the line from Yanqing to Changping, Kualiying, Shunyu, Dongzhou, Huangzhou, Baoti, Dingtaokou, Ninghou, and Lutai, and undertakes not to advance beyond that line to avoid any provocation and hostilities. Number 2. The Japanese authorities may at any time use airplanes or other means to verify carrying out anything of the above article. The Chinese authorities shall afford them protection and facilities for such purpose. Number 3. The Japanese Army, after ascertaining the withdrawal of the Chinese Army to the line stated in Article 1, undertakes not to cross the said line and not to continue to attack the Chinese troops and shall voluntarily withdraw, in general, to the Great Wall. Number 4. In the regions to the south of the Great Wall and to the north and east of the line defined in Article 1, the maintenance of peace and order shall be undertaken by a Chinese police force. Said police force shall not be constituted of armed units hostile to Japanese feelings. Number 5. The present agreement shall come into effect upon its signature. To these demands, Xi Jinping stated that since the Chinese army had already withdrawn to or even beyond what was asked of them, the Japanese forces should respond promptly by withdrawing from the battle zone to the Great Wall. Xi Jinping added that he hoped his Japanese colleagues understood the Chinese army might be required to help quell some bandits that might disturb the vacuum caused by the Japanese withdrawal. To this, the Japanese neither agreed nor disagreed, and the meeting ended at 9:20. During the interlude, the Chinese frantically sought to push further concessions. But the Japanese took a hard stance and stated they would only accept nothing until their demands were signed upon. Talks officially resumed at 10:57, and within only 15 minutes, both teams signed a truce agreement. Not a single change had been made in the draft the Kwantung Army had presented. By 2 p.m., Xi Jinping began a request that the Chinese army be permitted to deal with the bandits in the evacuated zone, as police alone would most likely not be enough. To this, the Japanese actually just ignored them. Once the Tanggu Truce had been signed, the Chinese began to fear rebellious warlord types, particularly those like Feng Yusung, might try to exploit the demilitarized region now that the Chinese Central Army had been withdrawn. The Japanese took a solid stance, opposing any exemptions to their truce, and would never allow Chinese army units within the demilitarized region. The Japanese, in response to the Chinese demand, stated, "In case there shall be in the demilitarized zone armed units disturbing peace and order, which the police force shall be unable to cope with, the situation will be dealt with by common accord between the two parties." The Chinese had no choice but to agree to this. Their final session resumed at 3:45 p.m., whereupon the Chinese tried to obtain an agreement on two specific aspects of the truce. Number 1, the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft would not conduct inspection flights without giving prior warning. Number 2, the Japanese army would not misconstrue a move by the Chinese army, which had already withdrawn behind the line established in the truce agreement, to return to the authorized line. The Japanese simply refused to even discuss these issues, and at 4:05 p.m. the Chinese simply signed. The Japanese then submitted 4 new demands. Number 1, withdraw the 2 cavalry divisions, formerly of the Northeastern Army, from the area southwest of Fengning in Johor Province. Number 2, move the 40 divisions of the Chinese Central Army presently in the Beiping-Tianjin region to some other appropriate region for the restoration of peace and order in that region. Number 3, remove the entrenchments and the military establishments of the Chinese Army in and around the mouth of the Pai River. Number 4, exercise strict control over anti-Japanese activities, which are the basic cause of Sino-Japanese conflict. To this, the Chinese agreed with the last 3 demands and promised to investigate the first. At 4:10, the truce talks officially ended. As a consequence of the Tanggu Truce, the Japanese army had gained a foothold in northeastern Hubei. They would press further in the coming years. Thus, this truce was basically the first step in conquering North China. As you can imagine, the Japanese were not done milking every single drop they could from the Chinese. During the entire Tangu Treaty talks, the Japanese had intentionally kept everything limited to military matters. The Japanese also sought to deal with what they expected to be a colossal anti-Japanese movement in North China. To this end, Foreign Minister Yoshida Yasua was given a list of demands to press upon the Chinese. Number 1, the Beiping Political Affairs Council will unreservedly suppress all anti-Japanese movements and other related anti-Japanese activities of the Kuomintang in the area under its jurisdiction. Number 2, the said council will unreservedly suppress all activities that disturb the peace in the area along the Great Wall by the use of militia units or other means from the area under its jurisdiction. Number 3, the said council will unreservedly remove all obstacles to legal, peaceful traffic across the Great Wall. Number 4, the said council will, with the agreement of the Japanese, establish facilities for the maintenance of order in a ceasefire district. The Japanese preferred this be met by a written agreement rather than a formal treaty, that would only hurt the face of China further, thus creating even more anti-Japanese movements. Real talks began at Daoren on July the 3rd, where the Kwantung Army suggested the responsibility for civil administration and maintenance of order in the demilitarized region be transferred from the Hubei provincial government to the Political Affairs Council at Beiping. The real reason as to why was because the Japanese believed they could easily control said body. When the IJ 6th and 8th Divisions withdrew from the demilitarized zone, they left behind small units at Miyun, Chenchang-ying, Xiaochangcheng, Fangtai, and Yuten, who went to work exerting silent pressure upon the Chinese during these future negotiations happening at Daoren. The Chinese at Daoren were represented by Li Shuchang, the director of the Beiping-Liaoning Railway, Yin Tong and Xu Chuyan of the Political Affairs Council, and Li Qichun, the head of the Mukden-Shanaguan Railway Bureau. General Kimura and Colonel Kita came to the meetings, but only in the capacity of observation. Included in the agenda of the conversations was the disposal of pro-Manchukuo militia forces in the demilitarized region and railway service between China proper and Manchukuo. Now, the idea to transfer administrative responsibility over the demilitarized region to the Political Affairs Council in Beiping offered numerous challenges. The council was essentially an organ of the executive yuan of the Nanjing government. Their purpose was to overlook negotiations for Nanjing. Moreover, their membership lacked prestige and they commanded no military forces, thus they had little influence over northern China. If they tried to influence the demilitarized region, a single army, such as one led by Li Qichun, could easily overpower their authority. Northern China was still very much warlord-dominated by this period. Li Qichun was a particularly strong warlord in said region. By December of 1932, he had begun recruiting men in the Qinxi district of Liaoning, where he was receiving aid from the Japanese. His men had assisted the Kwantung Army at Shimenjai and later fought under the guidance of Captain Okada Kikasaburo at Shanaguan. However, by Japanese standards, Li Qichung's army was nothing more than a bandit force. Thus, after the Tanggu Truce, the Kwantung Army chose to distance itself from Li Qichung and instead focus all their efforts in cooperating with the Political Affairs Council. Ironically, one of the first things the Kwantung Army consulted with the council was a new policy to dispose of Li Qichung's army, amongst others. Thus, 4,000 of Li Qichung's forces were reorganized into a peace preservation corps, with the rest simply disbanded. The finer details on how this would all occur was negotiated between Li Qichung and the council, mediated by the Kwantung officers at Tangshan on July 16th. It was also decided the Kwantung Army would set up an office at Tangshan, headed by Li Qichung, who would overlook the dispersal of militia units in the demilitarized region. By August 12th, the Peace Preservation Corps was fully established. Many pro-Manchukuo militia units were reorganized via the First Daoren Conference, as it became known. Shi Yuan's army at Jinhuangdao was reorganized into a Reserve Peace Preservation Corps under the direct guidance of Lieutenant Colonel Nakano Hidemitsu. They would be stationed at Yuten. Another force stationed near Jinhuangdao, which had been recruited by the Kwantung Army during Operation Nika, was ordered to transfer 2,000 of its troops to Manchukuo and have the rest disbanded. Additionally, there existed some 15,000 bandits operating within the demilitarized region. The largest of these bands was the East Asia Federation Combined Forces led by Guo Yazhou. He was actually in league with Xu Yusan and equipped like a regular Chinese army. Once the ceasefire had been in effect, his men were conscripted into Manchukuo and would be used unofficially by the Kwantung Army. Another large bandit army was led by Lao Haozu, known colloquially as the Old Rat. Many of these bandit groups were made up of discharged troops and deserters from pro-Manchukuo militia units. After much discussion, the Political Affairs Council took over the civil administration for the demilitarized zone, excluding the area consisting of the Great Wall. Another large item of discussion at the First Daoren Conference was the restoration of train services between China proper and Manchukuo. During the conflict, the Chinese army had ripped a ton of railway track between Beiping and Shanaguan. By April 21st, trains from Beiping could only operate as far as Tangu. Meanwhile, Manchukuo's Mukden to Shanaguan Railway was operating 3 trains a day between Shanaguan and Tangshan after numerous repair efforts by June 1st. Service between Tangu and Tangshan was only restored by July the 3rd when the Japanese garrison at Xianxin began guarding operations between the two cities. At Daoren, both sides agreed to rapidly restore the railway service between Mukden and Beiping while making Tangshan the temporary connecting point. The section between Shanhaiguan and Tangshan was to be administered by the Mukden-Shanhaiguan Railway, thus by Manchukuo, while from Beiping to Tangshan would be retained by the Chinese-governed Beiping-Liaoning Railway. The Chinese argued that once the railway lines were all restored, management over Tangshan to Shanhaiguan should be returned to the Chinese. However, the Manchukuo representatives instead argued for joint control over the railway from Beiping to Shanhaiguan. Despite all of the agreements met at Daoren, so much remained unresolved with the demilitarized region. The area immediately adjacent to the Great Wall had not been turned over to the Political Affairs Council. The demilitarized region was still infested with bandits. Many council members were not keen on any of the ongoings, and the relations between them and the Kwantung Army were anything but cooperative. Given all of this, in October of 1933, Huang Fu and He Yingqin came to the Japanese asking if they could form more official dialogues to deal with the problems, and this led to the Beiping Conference of November 1933. The Chinese were led by Huang Fu, He Yingqin, Yin Zong, Yin Zhukan, and Cao Changming. The Japanese were led by General Okimura, Colonels Kita and Kukichi Monya, Lieutenant Colonels Nimoto Hiroshi, and Shibayama Kaneshiro, and Secretaries Nakayama and Hanawa Yoshitaka of the Beiping legation. Because the talks had been opened by the Chinese, they had hoped they would control the agenda, and in that they would be sorely mistaken. The Japanese immediately pounced upon them and brought forth new demands. Number 1. The Kwantung Army hopes the Political Affairs Council will, as it solidifies its ability to maintain law and order, quickly and safely assume administration in the area south and west of the Great Wall, excluding the Great Wall. Number 2. For the time being, the Political Affairs Council recognizes in the area under its jurisdiction the various agencies designated by the Kwantung Army as necessary for the handling of transportation, economic matters, and other affairs. The Council will provide assistance in operation of these agencies. Number 3. For the time being, the Council agrees to lease the Japanese Army the land and buildings in the area under its jurisdiction, which are needed for the purpose of stationing Japanese troops. Number 4. To provide facilities for trade, transportation, and communications in the area south of the Great Wall, the Political Affairs Council will appoint a delegate who will immediately begin consultations with a delegate designated by the Kwantung Army. The Chinese agreed to the second demand, allowing for the establishment of the Kwantung Army at Shanhaiguan, Gubeikou, Xingfengkou, Pangqiaokou, Langkou, and Chilinkou. The Japanese garrisons could be stationed also at Shanhaiguan, Shumangjai, Zhenchaoying, Taitoying, Longkou, Xifengkou, Malangquan, and Gubeikou. The Chinese also agreed to Part 4 in regards to airline connections. Thus, with that, the Japanese had effectively taken away China's ability to defend the Great Wall. Furthermore, on the pretext of guarding said Great Wall, the Kwantung Army had forced the Chinese to recognize its right to garrison troops along the area just inside the Great Wall. Fully satisfied, the Japanese delegation departed Beiping on November the 10th. The Kwantung Army still sought to extend the Beiping-Liaoning railway services to Mukden, but this inevitably raised the issue of China proper recognizing Manchukuo. In December, Yin Zong, head of the Beiping-Liaoning Railway, traveled to Nanjing to discuss the issue, but would return to Beiping empty-handed. Additionally, Sun Fu, who had led a faction within the KMT, began persuading the Central Political Council to pass some legislation, specifically withholding Huang Fu from holding authority and handling issues involving North China. Because it was feared amongst many, it would lead to a mistake that would see the recognition of Manchukuo. On April the 11th of 1934, Huang Fu attempted a discussion at Nanchang between himself, Chiang Kai-shek, and Wang Jingwei. The result of this discussion was him receiving greater authority over matters involving postal services, train services, and tariffs. Despite this, the anti-Japanese part of the Nanjing government continued their efforts to hamper the efforts of Huang Fu and Yin Zong. In May, Major General Ishiro Koijun of the Kwantung Army, military attaché Shibayama, and Usayama Kanji, the chief of the Manchukuo Railways Bureau, began secret talks with Yin Zong over at Shanhaiguan. They all agreed to establish a new corporation, the Eastern Travel Bureau, who would receive $1 million provided in equal shares by the Mukden-Shanhaiguan Railway Bureau in Manchukuo and the Beiping-Liaoning Railway Bureau. Profits and losses would be shared equally. The general manager would be chosen from one borough, with the assistant manager chosen from the other, and trains would run daily from Mukden and Beiping, performing a transfer at Shanhaiguan. This idea was bitterly fought over at Nanjing, but after specific amendments would be ratified by July 1st. The first train departed Beiping on July 1st, and ironically, it would be interrupted midway between Tangu and Lutai by a bomb explosion on the track. Many Chinese civilians were hurt, but no incidents broke out. And we all know that little bomb had to be part of some grand false flag scheme that had failed. Now, the establishment of air services between China proper and Manchukuo would prove to be the most difficult one to settle. During the talks in Beiping, the Chinese agreed to provide transportation facilities that would include airline connections. But this did not materialize until February of 1935, when the Kwantung Army came up with a draft for a Sino-Japanese corporation. It would be funded equally by both sides. The Chinese would furnish the airfields and facilities, while the Kwantung Army would supply pilots and crews through the Manchukuo Aviation Corporation. The Kwantung Army also had nefarious plots involved in this deal. By securing the civilian airline service, they hoped to provide pilots and crews who, at the flip of a coin, could be converted to military operators, providing direct flights into China proper. At first, the Chinese showed no interest in such plans, so the Kwantung Army began military transport flights to Beiping from Jinzhou to twist their arm. By June, the agreement extended airfields at Baoting, Xuzhou, and Qingdao. The Chinese fought these demands as best as they could, but would continuously be outplayed. Still, the Kwantung Army was impatient to implement the civilian airline change and presented a new deal in June of 1935, offering to provide 55% of the funding from their side. To this, the Chinese counter-proposed the airfield should be located along the border, but the Japanese would not agree to this. By August, China set conditions to ratify the idea. Number 1. 2/3 of the capital investment would be provided by China and 1/3 by Japan. Number 2. Airport facilities would be restricted to the Beiping-Tianjin region. And number 3. Flight operations would be entrusted to the Aviation Department of the Eastern Travel Bureau. The Japanese still made demands, now seeking flights to all 5 provinces of North China. To this, the Chinese officials stated they would await instructions from Nanjing. The Kwantung Army broke off the talks and stated they would do whatever action they considered necessary to resolve the issue. By early September, Fu Zhouyi, the governor of Suyuan province, authorized a military flight to Baotou. Then on September the 28th and October the 10th, Japan conducted civilian test flights between Tianjin, Xinan, and Qingdao. Following the resolutions over the railway issues, on July the 9th of 1934, Yinzong went to Shanghai with Huang Fu, and then to Daoren by July the 23rd to meet with General Okimura, Colonel Kita, and Attaché Shibuyama to make deals over other issues. One issue was Japanese control over the entrance of Koreans and Japanese into the demilitarized region, the transfer to the Chinese of the Qing dynasty's mausoleum in Malanyu, the disposition of the peace preservation units, and the need for a postal service between China proper and Manchukuo. While this all sounds perhaps stupid to even mention, every single issue discussed was basically in danger of the Chinese accidentally recognizing Manchukuo, which was really the crux of it all. In the end, the Japanese made enormous inroads into North China through these negotiations. They forced the accommodation of rail and communication services between China proper and Manchukuo to normalize most trade between them and place their loyal protégés within the demilitarized region so they could be called police units. This was all accomplished through the Beiping Political Affairs Council, who, de facto, had recognized Manchukuo. All of this severely weakened the position of Nanjing in North China and enhanced Japan. But it was not quote-unquote Japan proper, but rather the Kwantung Army. However, there was absolute chaos going on in Japan during the times known as the government by assassination. Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyoshi was assassinated on May the 15th of 1932. Leading to the collapse of his cabinet. On May the 26th, a unity cabinet was formed under Admiral Seito Makoto. Civilian politicians were being knocked out by the military, particularly right-wing military figures. Admiral Seito selected Uchida Yasuo for foreign minister. At the time, he was a retired diplomat and the president of the South Manchurian Railway Company. Seito was plunged into some very wild times of Kwantung insubordination. To meet the chaos, he advocated 3 general principles. A. The separation from policy towards Manchukuo and Mongolia. B. the emphasis of economic measures, and C. Cooperation with the Western powers. By reading not so between the lines, you can see the official Japanese policy was basically to let the Kwantung Army run amok and plan accordingly for what seemed to be an enormous annexation program targeting North China and Inner Mongolia. It was to be an extremely volatile balancing act of encroaching upon Nanjing, but not enough so to bring the wrath of the Western great powers upon Japan. Minister Uchiha had served as foreign minister for 4 cabinets. In 1928, he signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and during the Manchurian crisis, he tried to fight the Kwantung Army, pushing them to stop their invasion. Yet it was also he who had helped recognize Manchu Kuo in 1932, and he who withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. He oversaw Operation Nika and the resulting Tanggu Truce. All of this spat in the face of international cooperation and basically showcased Japan to be a bully. Thus, he was really failing his initial goals, and he resigned in 1933 due to old age. He was succeeded by Hirohito Koki, who initially began his tenure advocating for the establishment of better relations with the United States, USSR, and China, and specifically to normalize Sino-Japanese relations. Hirohito was also confronted with a naval disarmament conference scheduled for 1935. There, Japan would be asked to make conciliatory moves with the U.S. Alongside this, a lot of problems were brewing with the USSR because of the establishment of Manchu Kuo. On the other side, Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Qingwei continued their appeasement stance, only to see Japan seize more and more from China. Yet Chiang Kai-shek was adamant. They must finish off the internal communist threat before embarking on what seemed to be an existential threat in the form of the Empire of Japan. I would like to take this time to remind all who this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary covering the Boxer Rebellion in Russo-Japanese War, titled The Fight for Asia. Over on Echoes of War, we are releasing a 5-part series covering the Malaysian campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And if you go check it out right now, the latest exclusive podcast is an alternate history episode looking at an alternate history of the Pacific War. It's a multi-part series, and the first episode is titled The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor. So if that sounds interesting to you, go check it out. The Kwantung Army was not only efficient at slicing up China with its dagger, but rather capable with the pen as well. Continuous negotiations were leading the Chinese to hand more and more over to Japan. How long could the Chinese people continue to support their seemingly incapable government during these times of crisis?